There is a general principle here, though, and it makes perfect sense, which is the larger and more complex the project and the greater the risks, then the longer it's going to take to assess. So you can't simply say a large project should take a year. You have to look at each project and try and make assessments about the size, the complexity, the level of public interest, and the risks in order to come up with some kind of reasonable timeline. How efficient, then, we can ask, was RPDC process? Well, that goes back to the question of when it actually began, and I've said that you can assume, I think, a sensible time for suggesting it began was with point 2 there, when GUNS submits its first project scope in November 2004. That seems to me to be a perfectly defendable date. It was around that time, too, when the project was declared to be a project of state significance. What about the end date? What can we speculate about the end date? Christopher Wright, in the second directions hearing in Launceston, made it clear that he didn't think that the process could be completed before November this year and could drag on into early next year. I think probably the longest it could have gone on for is, say, March 2008. So if you take those first and end dates, you can see that there was a period of 3 years and 4 months in total to assess this project. But that raises the question, is that too long? What do we know about the project? Well, it's extremely large, extremely complicated, and extremely risky. So that might justify a longer than normal assessment process, but then again, it begs the question of what normal might be. I had a quick look at what the UK has been doing in terms of project approval processes, and I noted that the Heathrow Terminal 5 took 7 years to approve. That's clearly very long and possibly not very efficient. Likewise, the North Yorkshire electricity grid took 6 years and 5 months, and the Dibden Bay container port upgrade more than 3 years. Now, don't ask me for any details on those because I don't know. But equally well, the Coventry Airport, and I don't know if that was a new or an upgrade, it only took a year to approve, and something to do with Felixstowe Harbour only took a year too. So you can do it in a shorter time, you can take an awful lot longer. If you take those two figures and simply do an even division, you come up with 3 to 3.5 years. Would that constitute normal? I don't know. The British government's concerned to get its longer project approval processes down, but it hasn't, of course, and wouldn't set a timeline on it because, as I said, you have to take each project on its own merits. There's another compelling reason for saying that 3.5 years or 3 years and 4 months might not in fact be too long if you look at the fact that the government and the proponent are both to some extent to blame for some of the delays. The government's to blame because it refused to rein in the pulp mill task force, which ultimately led to Rafferty and Green's resignation. And Guns are to blame for changing their scope, their project scope, on the final day of the first public hearings, throwing that into disarray and causing a second round of public hearings having to be held. So given that the government and Guns were in part responsible for the delays, and given that it's only 3 years and 4 months anyway, to say March 2008, it does not seem at first blush that the RPDC process was as inefficient as is being claimed. What about the PMAA? Well, I think there's a consensus on this that it is highly efficient. And this is largely because it builds on past work done. It only considers a limited number of factors in relation to the mill. It eliminates the need and the requirement for public submissions and public hearings. And it's focused entirely on technical matters, if you like, related to whether or not the mill will technically meet the guidelines. I'm going to quickly run through these last 2 points because I am running out of time, and I do want to just finish up without boring you too much. But science is a critical component of good environmental decision-making. Now, when we think of science, we have to be careful. In the public mind, scientists seem to agree on things, and therefore there are facts out there which are indisputable and undeniable. Now, a moment's reflection will make us realize that that's not what science is about at all. Science are, or should be, notorious skeptics. They are, like Socrates, they know what they don't know. And they, of course, invariably get it wrong because they operate within certain understandings which may not be shared by other scientists. The important point here is that scientists need the opportunity to review the work of other scientists. Science is a deliberative, dialogical exercise in which the work of one scientist is reviewed, replicated, criticized, and extended by the work of other scientists. It is simply not the case that scientists can be relied on, if you like, to completely and utterly know the truth. And they would be the first to say that they don't, which is why they're often very hesitant to give policy advice. Both processes invoked science to resolve some of the issues. RPDC used Becca Amek as its principal consultant or scientific advisor on the technical aspects of the mill, but supplemented Becca Amek's work with a range of other consultants who were scientists evaluating various components of the mill. There was some effort through the public submissions and presumably through the hearings process for testing the documentation. So if you like, RPDC scientists were testing gun scientists, and the public submission and hearings process would test both RPDC scientists and gun scientists. So there was that element of dialogical and discursive nature around the science and the data and the models. The government's PMAA process sought to simply terminate that dialogical debate by invoking Swaco-Pick as the scientist who would make the determination on the emission side, and ITS Global as the definitive word on the social and economic benefits of the mill. In that sense, then, there was an attempt, if you like, to deny the essence, if you like, of science, and to go back to the popular image of science as those people who know the truth. Risk is my final category, you'll be relieved to hear. And of course, projects vary in terms of their risk. Sometimes they're not terribly risky at all. And sometimes they can be very risky indeed. A particular pulp mill, of course, had enormous and has enormous risks attached to it. These are economic risks, there are health risks, there are serious environmental risks, and a whole range of social risks.